Hello, Marta. Nice to see you.
Hello, Anna. Good to see you.
Yeah.
Pardon my English. Renato, hello.
Hi, Marta. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for asking me, for including me.
It was a pleasure. Let me introduce you, Eneida Almeida, who is the moderator of your talk today.
Terrific.
Eneida is our, she's here. Eneida is our co-head of the program of architecture and urbanism in São Judas University, the graduate program.
Perfect.
And she's very interested in your work too. I hope you have a good time.
I think it will be great.
So we made a little break, and now I think we do you prefer we share your slides, or you prefer to share yourself?
I just sent you my I can share them. It's fine. I wasn't sure if I would be able to screen share, but I see that I can now. So do you want me to start that now, or how would you? I'm ready to go. So
yes, I will ask to Eneida to make an introduction of you for the attendance. We have a simultaneous translation. Then you can choose the language you can hear, and below of your Zoom you have the interpretation mode. If you click there, you can choose if you would like to activate the languages.
Okay. I think during my talk I won't have any activation.
Yes, no problem, but Eneida will talk in Portuguese to our audience, then you can hear her introduction in the simultaneous translation, and then we are ready to hear from you. We're very proud. Fernando Vasquez made a brief introduction of Marshall Berman and the inspiration for the climate change in the future. We have here the Climapolis board. There is Max Planck Institute and Instituto de Astrofísica and Geociências e Ciências Atmosféricas in São Paulo, of the University of São Paulo. Then we are very proud to connect the basic science and human science to face our future. Thank you for accept our invitation.
Sure. Just to be clear, I'm not going to be speaking so much about climate change and Marshall Berman, but just more generally about him. I hope that's okay.
Of course, it will be, Marta. Eneida, it's up to you now.
Thank you. Marta Gutman é reitora interina da Bernard N. Spitzer School of Architecture no The City College of New York. Ela é historiadora da arquitetura e da cidade, arquiteta licenciada, coordenou o programa de História da Arquitetura na Spitzer School por muitos anos. Ela é também membro do corpo docente do programa de doutorado em História da Arte e Ciências da Terra e do Meio Ambiente e do Graduate Center CUNY. Atualmente está escrevendo um novo livro, Just Space Modern Architecture, Race and Public Schools and Post-War Urban America. A editora Times Higher nomeou seu livro anterior premiado, A Seed for Children, human architect, the charitable landscapes of Oakland from 1850 to 1950, o livro do ano, chamando-o de Uma Conquista Monumental. Gutman é editora fundadora do Fórum Digital da Platform, editou edifícios e paisagens para o Fórum de Arquitetura Vernacular e contribuiu para o livro Aventuras no Modernismo, Thinking com Marshall Berman, editado por Jennifer Corby, 2016. Seu capítulo intitulado Teaching Marshall Teaching Encounters with Berman é uma reflexão inspiradora sobre ensino, aprendizagem e encontros. Obrigada, professora Marta Gutman, por aceitar nosso convite. A palavra é sua.
My turn. Thank you. Let me share my screen. Great. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Anaida. And great to see you also, Renato. It's a pleasure to be here this morning discussing Marshall Berman, my friend and colleague at the City University of New York. And I think Anaida mentioned this already, and my apologies for speaking in English. My Portuguese is not existent, my loss. But I just did want to give you a heads up that this talk is based on my essay, Teaching Marshall Teaching Encounters with Berman, that was published a few years ago in the edited collection, Adventures in Modernism. And also a heads up that I will read my talk this morning in the interest of keeping to time. So I'll start by sharing my encounter with Marshall, and then I'll discuss how I prompt my students at the Spitzer School of Architecture to grapple with Marshall's ideas in the Survey of World Architecture sequence, one that I put together several years ago. I'll close by sharing some of their work with you. And yes, I'm channeling Marshall in taking this decision. So first, a word or two about the backstory. I arrived at the City College of New York in the fall 2004 with my PhD, my new PhD in hand. I had studied architecture at Columbia University in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And after I graduated, I practiced and taught architecture in New York City for about 10 years. That is until I decided to set aside the practice of architecture and to write its history instead. This decision took my husband, our then 2 young children, who are now grown up, of course, and me to Berkeley, where I completed a doctorate in architectural history at the University of California at Berkeley under the supervision of Del Upton. And the offer of a position at City College subsequently brought us back to the East Coast. And my charges at the architecture school included invigorating required courses in the history of modern architecture. And no surprise that I turned to Marshall Berman for inspiration. I knew Berman. We'd met at a colloquium in the mid-1980s in a stuffy basement classroom that the architecture school used at Columbia University. The exact topic of the colloquium has slipped from my memory, but I think it had been organized to commemorate the 1968 student strike. And the university's administrators had brooded for decades about the strike, and they worried that a gathering like this one, or like that one, would give students cause to rally against them. I came because I wanted to meet Marshall Berman, the man who is shown on your screen here, on our screen here. I'd read All That Is Solid Melts into Air, The Experience of Modernity, and it had opened me to a new way of thinking about architecture, cities, urbanism, politics, literature, culture, and history. When Marshall Berman walked into the room, I guessed correctly that this was the man of the Jewish left whom I wanted to meet. I had started to question the norms of architectural practice, history, and education, especially education. And I wanted to tell Berman that I'd read his book, that his interdisciplinary reach, his emphasis on process and ambiguity, his conjoined optimism and pessimism, the physical situatedness of his historical analysis reassured me that my questions were on the mark. I also wanted to tell him that his elegant, accessible prose resonated with me, and that, like him, I love to read. But hearing my last name, Berman looked intently at me and directed the conversation in an entirely different direction. He told me that he had loved my father, Herbert Gutman, his colleague at City College and the Graduate Center, who had died of a heart attack a year or so before Berman and I met. In these tender words, I sensed, or in his tender words, I sensed an expression of solidarity as I recalled the dedication of all that is solid to his young son, Mark, whose tragic death was a devastating loss to Berman. I realized later in life that I had misconstrued the source of his empathy when I understood that his condolences came from another aching corner of his big heart. Berman's father had also died young and also from a heart attack. Looking back, it's clear that reading All That Is Solid helped launch the intellectual trajectory that sent me back to graduate school, away from practice and toward history. At Berkeley, I learned to situate Berman's thinking in the long, rich tradition of Marxist humanism, and to admire Jürgen Habermas and Henri Lefebvre, who, like Berman, addressed absences in classic Marxist thinking. Like these thinkers, I wanted to put places, spaces, processes, production, construction, and cities with the struggles, dreams, and urban experiences of everyday people squarely in the center of my historical analysis. I also, at Berkeley, learned to admire Max Weber and Michel Foucault, thinkers for whom Berman had sharp words in All That Is Solid, and to question the illusion of gender, of race, capitalism, of gender and racial capitalism, and the Eurocentrism of his book. So I opened my first lecture at City College by inviting my students to consider the interaction of buildings with the places and societies that produce them, and to think about the implications of architectural forms within society and the responsibility of those who design them. In exploring how to read buildings as documents of political, social, and environmental and of political, social, environmental, ecological, and philosophical values, I wanted to encourage my students to begin to form ideas of the kinds of architects they wanted to become, and to consider how they could transform society through the places they had created. So far, so good. Then I mentioned that I wanted to add another idea into the mix, a concept that had been authored by my colleague, Marshall Berman, and that was especially germane to the topic of my course, modern architecture. And here I refer to modernity, modernization, and modernism, the triad that Berman formulated in Modernity, Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow, the introduction to All That Is Solid. And this expression, modernity, modernization, and modernism, has slipped into the popular lexicon, at least among academics, and it has been subject to their exacting scrutiny, but it confused my students. And it came as relief to see a raised hand amidst the baffled faces. And when I called on the student, and I later learned her name was Marina Correa, and yes, she was an immigrant from Brazil, she said that she'd read Berman's book and that she was excited to learn that he taught at City College, since she intended to double major in architecture and philosophy. She wanted to meet him, and it was easy enough for me to direct her to the Department of Political Science, where I believe she did indeed meet with Marshall. So Marina's enthusiasm was exceptional. I wish I could report otherwise, but many students had trouble relating the Bermanian triad of modernity, modernization, and modernism to the design of the beautiful buildings they wanted to make, even though they engaged with the processes embedded in this premise all the time in their design studios. Their aspirations aligned with Berman's in that they wanted to make buildings that felt modern, looked modern, and were made of modern materials. And their enthusiasm for the modern, the now, and the experimental conformed to Berman's faith in and embrace of youth culture. But they doubted that taking the time to dissect the term modern as an intellectual or historical construct would be of much help in their design quest. Berman asked us to call on all that we know and where we have been in configuring what we make. He insisted that history cannot be set aside because it makes us who we are. It makes us political. As William Faulkner has reminded us, the past isn't dead. It isn't even past. My students were dubious. They were enrolled in a professional program in architecture. Their goal was to become practitioners, not historians, not political scientists, not sociologists. For many of them, history is a nightmare from which they are trying to escape, to paraphrase James Joyce. And this extraordinarily diverse body includes many who are recent arrivals to the United States, Marina among them, immigrants who had been displaced from their homes by political and economic crises long in the making, and who understood persecution, bias, hardship, and inequality firsthand. They did indeed want to make socially responsible buildings because they cared passionately about justice, equity, and freedom. But they shared these beliefs widespread among students of design. To be modern, a building needs to stand on its own 2 feet outside of history. To study history puts one at risk of endorsing historicism in design. And it is the designer, not society, not an audience, who determines the meaning of an object or a place in the constructed environment. These are grave misconceptions, and to encourage my students to question them, I expanded my discussion of Berman and experimented with my manner of presentation. So just to share how I do this. So my students arrive in my classroom for the 3rd semester of the 4-semester sequence in world architecture history. The focus is the long 19th century, and I call on Marshall in the introductory lecture because I want to start a conversation about modernism. I want my students to hold fast to their belief in the possibility of architecture as an art. I also want them to question their understandings of architecture's autonomy. So reinforced in studios, in design studios, to my grave, not something I endorse. So I read the first paragraph of All That Is Solid while projecting a digital slide with the same text placed next to an impressionist painting of an iron and glass train shed in Haussmann's Paris. To attach Berman's words to urban spaces and historical processes discussed in the course, I selected this view of the Gare Saint-Lazare that Claude Monet painted in 1877 and that now hangs in the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. I hope to emulate Berman's politicized interdisciplinarity by pairing a startling image with a provocative text. I wanted my students to understand that image and document exist simultaneously in art, and this dialectical simultaneity, this resonance and this wonder, to borrow from Stephen Greenblatt, come at no cost to aesthetic experience. So at the risk of stating the obvious, my pedagogical experiment profited from the historical processes of invention described in Berman's work. Early in the 21st century, I projected a digital image of a painting made by a radical artist in the 1870s as my students read and heard me read a text written a century later by another radical thinker. And I'll read that text to you now. There is a mode of vital experience of space and time, of the self and others, of life's possibilities and perils that is shared by men and women all over the world today. I will call this body of experience modernity. To be modern is to find ourselves in an environment that promises us adventure, power, joy, growth, transformation of ourselves and the world, and at the same time that threatens to destroy everything we have, everything we know, everything we are. Modern environments and experiences cut across all boundaries of geography and ethnicity, of class and nationality, of religion and ideology. In this sense, modernity can be said to unite all mankind, but it is a paradoxical unity, a unity of disunity. It pours us all into a maelstrom of perpetual disintegration and renewal, of struggle and contradiction, of ambiguity and anguish. To be modern is to be part of a universe in which, as Marx said, all that is solid melts into air. So to reiterate a point I just made, this phrase, and modernity, modernism, and modernization is not known to my students. They aren't familiar with dialectical thinking or with thinking that modernism is a historical construct. And I see stunned faces as I read through the paragraph and reach the closing sentence, which I just read to you. To be modern is to be part of a universe, which, as Marx said, all that is solid melts into air. I think some of them are concerned with literal collapse, that the iron and glass shed is structurally unsound. So I start to historicize. We see the first station from the 1830s, the large image on your screen. And I explained that it was expanded in the late 1840s and early 1850s when the engineer, the civil engineer, Eugène Flachat, designed the Great Shed and the Pont de l'Europe, the bridge over the railroad yards, in the small image you see on your screen, in conjunction with Haussmann's plan for Paris. The station, overhauled again, once again in the 1880s, attracted the attention of any number of painters and photographers. Monet was one, and he started to paint a remarkable series of views of the station after he moved from a small village near Paris to a neighborhood near the building. Living within the city offered him new subjects, the scenes from urban life that Charles Baudelaire asked artists to put front and center in their work, rather than the rural settings for which he had become known. And Berman would have appreciated, with a chuckle, that this decision was in no small measure market-driven. As progressive art critics urged Impressionist painters to depict modern life in Paris, Monet's colleagues, who were also his competitors, obliged. To keep up and to sell his work, Monet needed to expand his repertoire. And so this beautiful painting of the train station, alive with color and light, documents a place where Berman's triad, modernity, modernization, and modernism, intersected in Haussmann's Paris. As he did in other images in the series, Monet deliberately depicted the back of the Gare Saint-Lazare, not the elegant Beaux-Arts entry facade. In this view, he dramatized the astonishing spaces and metal structure of the train shed that Flachat designed. Slender iron columns are shown supporting the great shed, which is spanned with trusses and an iron and glass roof. Its transparent roof frames the railroad tracks and the large bridge that crosses over the sprawling yards and separates the gritty site from this glittering place in the bourgeois city beyond the fashionable 8th arrondissement. Dwarfed by the magnificent shed and other products of the industrial age, a few railroad workers stand on the tracks while other working class Parisians gather on the sidewalk that is just outside the station. In their immediate view are 3 huge trains, one idle, one arriving from Normandy, another departing, and large plumes of smoke from the coal-fired engines on the trains spill out of the train stack, polluting the air. Art historians usually cast Monet as an apolitical artist, so it isn't surprising that his formal experimentation is highlighted on the Musée d'Orsay's website. The description reads, quote, "In spite of the apparent geometry of the metallic frame, What prevails here is really the effects of color and light, rather than concern for describing machines and travelers in detail, close quote. Not quite, since this image equally depicts the smelly, noisy, hardscrabble, workaday world of the railroad yards. It engaged bourgeois viewers in the late 1870s with urban places and city people that they may well have preferred to ignore. By virtue of the view selected by the artist and his use of color and light, this painting of the Gare Saint-Lazare represents what Berman called the paradoxical unity, a unity of disunity of modernity in 19th century Paris. Beyond the shadows cast by the shed, past the smoky trains and dirty yards, new hotels and apartment buildings, all clad in elegant cream-colored stone, glimmer in the bright summer sun. And this luxurious urban world, visually accessible to travelers entering or leaving the city by train, is unobtainable and all but invisible to the people in the yards. Standing on the same level as the trains and placed to one side of the station, where some are shrouded in smoke, the human figures in the painting echo the social geography of the city at large. The urban transformations unleashed by Haussmann forced working class Parisians to move from the center of the city to its outskirts. As in the painting, they occupied the edge. These transformations, the ones that rendered Paris modern, made the familiar worlds of working class Parisians melt into air. So we pick up the themes later in the semester when we return to Paris and study Haussmann's plan. We revisit Monet's painting, now paired with Caillebott's of the bridge and his other depictions of the new center of Paris, the glittering world of privileges and service, of elite privileges and services. And we compare the new services, the new center, to another part of Paris, also new and also modern, the urban world of people who lived in shacks and sheds at the edge of the city. And our global scope widens. So we discuss the Bermanian triad in conjunction with colonialism, imperialism, and racial capitalism. The French invasion and seizure of Alteirs is a particularly apt example. And starting in 1832, as I'm sure you know, the French generals seized the property in the center of Algiers, colored dark blue on the plan, called for demolition of mosques, renamed the public square the Place d'Armes, regulated its shape, adding arcades, trees, and statues, ignored the Kasbah in planning urban improvements, focusing on the part of town that had been occupied by the Ottoman elite, and experimented with parcellement, with forging new streets over an older urban fabric long before Haussmann applied the same technique in central Paris. It is for these reasons and many more that Louis H.G. Lyautey, the French general in residence in Morocco at the beginning of the 20th century, called the French colonies laboratories for modernism. So by this time of the semester, which is about by the 12th week or so, the import of Berman's triad, modernity, modernization, and modernism, is becoming clearer to my students, as is the thinking of other scholars who worked in the tradition of Marxist humanism, notably Henri Lefebvre. I ask my students to make Lefebvre's thinking their own. And like Berman, Lefebvre theorized the production of space. He insisted that space isn't immanent, it isn't given, it isn't static, and that it is constructed physically, socially, and discursively. I've often wondered whether Marshall drew on the Lefebvrean triad in formulating his own. And I've also wondered about the ties of Marshall's interest in the right of the city to Lefebvre's insistence on the same. And I've wondered about Berman's take on other scholars who work in this tradition. And Jürgen Habermas comes to mind because of his theorizing of publicity and privacy, issues of great interest to Marshall. So I'd like to close my talk by bringing this discussion back to teaching, specifically to an assignment that I've invented for graduate students in the third semester of survey, one that asks students to scrutinize the Bermanian and Lefebvrean triads: modernity, modernization, the production of space as a physical, social, and discursive proposition. It asks them to scrutinize these triads in relationship to subjectivity. And I ask each student to take on a historical character and to interpret physical settings through the lens of that character's persona. The goal is for them to gain a clearer understanding of their subjectivities as designers through having to be objective about another person, their character's take on architecture, and also by sharing, they share their insights in seminar presentations that are often constructed and configured as performances. So when I read Marshall's essay, Take It to the Streets, which was published in Dissent in 1986 and reprinted in this marvelous collection, I realized that I was doing something more, that I was asking my students to reflect on what Marshall called the dialectics of double lives. Excuse me. This is a marvelous piece of writing, one that asks us to reflect on what Marshall called, quote, the split of the modern man and the modern woman into a public person, a citizen, and a private person, an individual. He talked about, close quote, he talked about, quote, the dream of resolving inner contradictions and living in a more integrated way, and the need for a radical transformation to make this happen, with people coming together freely to do it on their own. And he emphasized in this political context, the idea of public space takes on a special urgency. And of course, in 1986, the political context Marshall was referring to was the context of Ronald Reagan's America, of the spread of what we then called neoconservatism. But the words are so prescient. They apply, they haunt us, they apply in our own time. And so I find it isn't surprising that my students' openness to Berman mounted as their own situations changed after the economy, their own situations and the broader political situation changed, speaking here of the fiscal crisis of 2009 and the 2016 presidential election. And especially in these situations, Berman's dialectical thinking helped them grapple with their place in a very troubled world. And so they still struggle to grasp the differences between modernity, modernism, and modernization. But they look astonished when I tell them that their counterparts once disputed Berman's argument that modernity is a paradoxical unity, a unity of disunity. They agree that they, as thinking, sensing modern subjects, share the common experience of modernity, and that they belong to the liberating, democratizing processes that it unleashed. They no longer look at me in disbelief when I ask them to recognize that modernization has also and all too often caused disaster, and that it continues to unleash devastating changes with consequences that we don't fully grasp. The environmental crisis shows no sign of abating, the topic of your conference. The security state continues to expand. Racism is ingrained in the United States, at least. Women lose rights daily, and income inequality isn't checked. I receive fewer stares when I insist that since modernity causes ambiguous outcomes in architecture, architects must assess these outcomes in light of their ethically adequate or inadequate consequences. Aesthetic experiences matter to modernism, but aesthetic evaluation only tells part of the story of the consequences of being modern. And so in 2007, in 2007, my Students spoke to these issues in a seminar presentation that I'm about to share with you, and several of them are shown. These are the students of the class that I'm speaking about. It was offered in the final class held on December 2nd, about a month after the presidential election, the outcome of which had traumatized them. And so their assignment was to imagine a visit to Mulberry Bend in 1900, an infamous slum on Manhattan's Lower East Side that was erased in a state-sponsored slum clearance project, one of the first in New York City, and reconfigured as a small park. They were asked to assess it in their characters, taking accounts of readings from Jacob Riis, Ebenezer Howard, and other reformers. And it was Jacob Riis's photographs in part that prompted the slum clearance project. And so these are the characters they chose. Glenn Bell took on the character of Nat Turner, the enslaved African-American preacher who led a slave revolt in Virginia in 1831 and was quickly executed. Sarah Ahmad took on the character of Jean-Michel Basquiat, the well-known artist of the 1980s, and Kia Robinson took on the character of Shirley Chisholm, the politician, first representative from one of the early African-American representatives elected to the American Congress from Brooklyn, and at one point a candidate for president. And so they proposed this setting, a bar where Turner and Basquiat participated in a poetry slam that Shirley Chisholm moderated. And so now I read from their presentation, and yes, they've given me permission to share their work with you. So good morning, everyone. I'm Shirley Chisholm, and I've been asked to be the MC for today's poetry slam. Although I'm a political figure, I find it important to hear the voices of others capitalized in her text, no matter their background. You will hear the voices of artists, innovators, musicians, and religious leaders on their perspective of Mulberry Street. So let me establish some ground rules. First things first, I ask that we respect the presenters and their views. And although you may disagree with any of the presenters' spoken words, today's stage is not your platform. Secondly, save any questions you may have to the end. And lastly, as a sign of praise, we ask that you kindly snap your fingers to demonstrate instead of applauding. And thank you for your time and attention, and enjoy the show. And I just would add as a side, then my two students proceeded to rap, and I cannot rap, but I will read you the words of their presentation. And so here is what Glenn Bell as Nat Turner offered the audience. This physicality affects my spirituality. Let's talk about it. BEND, busy exploiting New York development. BEND, say it with me. Overcrowding, women oppressed, children slaving, yet the Italian men complaining. BEND, physical meeting. Jam-packed tenants, small rooms, temperatures high, no choice in this maze in these New York City streets. Only alleyways do you find relief from the heat. BEND, Pierce said, spatial organization is the way to prove through economic independence, women can too. BEND, say it loud, Howard's three magnets, low rates, low rent, no isolation, cooperation and freedom. Seriously, in this capitalistic country town, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit is the only Trinity I avow. BEND, symbolic meaning, confusion in the maze. 609 has tenants encaged. Like the slaves in my days, yes, it's all too familiar. The resultant crime and death has become all too peculiar. BEND, benediction. Now unto him that is able to keep you from falling and to present you faultless before the presence of his glory, to the wise God, our Savior, be glory and majesty, dominion and power, both now and forever. Amen. And then Sarah, as Jean-Michel Basquiat replied, when these are her slides. to have lived similarly and to have experienced mutually a broken family with attempts to make up gun futility. I too can speak to the horrors within the City of Lights. My own upbringing would lead me to battle my own fights. So as I walk through the tenements of Mulberry, I am recalled to my days of destitution, to my future so contrary. I see how the poor live on top of one another, and how the streets reek, ready to smother your senses of smell, diluting within sight in a pinnacle of poverty's height. The words of Reese jump off the page as I walk through the bend. Who would have thought a famous turned Brooklyn boy would once again revisit the West End? From the lofts in Soho, I am now walking past the tenements near NoHo. I am greeted yo-yo by street vendors and businessmen, all crouched together like hens in a coop. Not so different from women passing by in their gossiping group. I'm provoked by the tobacco seller, yet ultimately sickened by the fish vendor's stoop. Yes, to the obvious poverty, but the illegality of space hurts the most. These landlords should have nothing about to boast. How was this place once called Paradise Square? Give rise to tap dance at Almack's, now surely in despair. Where is the government? Where is the awareness? How can the streets be of any fairness? Landlords giving no heed to any level of social welfare. Dead animals on the street. What an utter nightmare. All of a sudden, I feel like I'm Sinclair. Perhaps in the jungle, do I dare compare? Tammany Hall political recalls here in the street hall, the complete unveil of life's true tale of how the poor live and work to no avail. I'm sorry to speak so darkly, Nat Turner, but you must understand that I too agree with your dismay. These conditions must change, and we can't just rely on prey. Oh, and what did Howard say? Higher pay? Turner, what do you think? Is that the only way? And so I would have liked to discuss these experiences with Marshall Berman and share with him how much my students had learned from their encounter with all that is solid. But by the fall of 2017, he was gone. And anyway, I knew that he preferred to focus on his new work, not on the book that made him famous. Over the years, we met casually, shared a couple of meals, celebrated a few holidays together, and chatted about other matters of importance to us, especially our children. Berman also once spoke to my graduate seminar when the topic was the Bronx, his beloved borough, and a place that he discussed at length in All That Is Solid. He mourned the loss of the Bronx of his youth, and he evinced no love for the Cross Bronx Expressway or its principal author, Robert Moses. But he questioned historians who ascribed the destruction of a vital neighborhood to one horrific structure or one powerful man. In Buildings Our Judgment, his review of Robert Caro's The Power Broker, published in Ramparts, he wrote, "The devastation of that world was really horrible, Yet there is something wrong with Caro's picture. It was not only that as children of the New Deal, we all believed in the ultimate beneficence of good government, centralized planning, and large-scale public works," and shown here with the photo of the picture of Moses from the 1930s. But beyond that, all of us were possessed by the great American dream of mobility. To live the good life meant physically to move out, socially to move up. That was the only way to go. And with his backward glance, Berman touched on a point that he had made earlier in his career. He insisted that studying Moses would help Americans learn to build again. In exploring Moses's work, unraveling his achievements, disentangling the beauty from the horror, we may be able to develop some sense of how to actually build things, how to put the vision and the plans, the materials and the people together. If we remember that buildings are judgment, we may be able to win a better judgment for ourselves next time around. He also alluded to a new project, this isn't talking with my seminar, that he was starting to formulate, one focused on childhood, youth, and popular culture in contemporary New York City. And he gave this topic center stage in Emerging from the Ruins, the 2013 Lewis Mumford lecture that Marshall delivered at City College. We didn't know it then, but Emerging from the Ruins proved to be Marshall Berman's last public lecture. In the great hall, packed with hundreds of admirers, Berman invited us to think with him about the resurgence of New York City and the children who helped to make it happen. He told us that African-American and Latinx boys and girls who grew up in the Bronx, Harlem, and Brooklyn helped us to think about the city in new ways when they made art in neighborhoods that had been devastated by the urban crisis. They gave us new music, new art, and new dance, and they taught us to see New York City, Manhattan, and the outer boroughs together as one vital, pulsing, creative place. Although he didn't cite the words that opened all that is solid, his argument reminded me of them. To be modern is to find ourselves in an environment that promises us adventure, power, joy, growth, transformation of ourselves and the world. The voice was strong, but the body, alas, was not. And now that he has gone, who will keep Berman's storytelling alive? Who will hear, see, write, tell, and teach the city? Who will make the romance of building come alive again? I like to think that Marshall Berman would say he placed his trust in us. Thank you.
Obrigada, Marta, por esse seu depoimento, esse ensinamento, assim, de uma riqueza, de uma densidade que nos toca e nos emociona. Então, eu, assim, em nome aqui do evento, eu gostaria, antes de tudo, agradecê-la por essas palavras, por esses ensinamentos que nos conectam, né, com as reflexões de Berman, com esses estudos sobre modernidade, processo de modernização, mas, sobretudo, permitem recolocar essas ideias aqui para nós hoje, né? E a partir delas, discutirmos os próprios fundamentos da disciplina, do estudo da arquitetura, da cidade, do ensino da arquitetura, porque é isso que você nos traz, né, como argumento, partindo da história da arte, conectando com a história da arquitetura e o processo de ensinamento, essa relação com os alunos, essa conversa entre professores e alunos, né? Para se pensar na arquitetura, nos desafios que a arquitetura já nos colocava lá no início do século XX, na passagem do século XIX para o século XX, com os desafios que a transformação do mundo moderno nos colocava, e diante das contradições, né, e conflitos que estavam ali presentes e que hoje se recolocam. De certo modo, a gente pode revivê-los e atualizá-los, né? Esses conflitos estão presentes na atualidade, né? E são temas da discussão deste seminário, né? As questões ambientais, as aflições, né, desse mundo em destruição, de certo modo, que precisa ser repensado, reinventado, né? E você nos traz, eu acho, que essa dimensão não só do conflito, da contradição, do desmonte, do desmanche, mas da reconstrução, da reinvenção, essa possibilidade de transformação. Eu acho que é esse assim, o principal aspecto da sua fala que me emocionou e me tocou, né? Então, eu gostaria, assim, para iniciar, retomar, né, colocar, dar novamente a você a palavra, de que modo, então, né, podemos nós, professores, pensadores, intelectuais, acender, né, essa luz, de alguma maneira oferecer aos nossos alunos estímulos e incentivos, né? Eu acho que você já falou disso aqui, né? Mas se a gente pode retomar um pouco desse teu ensinamento, dessa escuta e dessa concessão de palavras aos alunos, né? Como a partir da própria experiência eles podem encontrar esses caminhos. Fiz um giro de palavras aqui, espero que tenha sido claro.
So I have to say this is my first experience with simultaneous translation. It's very interesting. Thank you for those compliments. That's very generous of you. I think we have to listen to our students. That's what I think we have to do. I think our students have. I think we need to listen to our students. I think we need to hear what they have to say and encourage them to dream in the face of they understand better than we do the daunting realities that we face as a world, and they're the ones who are inheriting the mess that we have given them, and we have given them a huge mess. And whatever country we're in right now, it's the propositions are daunting, and so I think we need their voices. That's what we need. And so much of the way in which teaching is constructed is that the student receives the wisdom from the teacher, and rather than the other way around. And for me, what so that would be one thing, and I see the hands. What would be one thing? One point I would raise, and then the other point I would say is that we need in our teaching to ask and encourage students to understand that architecture and constructed environments are multidimensional. They're not. And I have found not only Berman but Lefebvre very, very helpful with students who are struggle in their design studios to come to terms with the way they see the world and the way their teachers ask them to see the world. And so when we show them that space is constructed, that it exists in physical, social, and discursive dimensions, it's liberating to them. Anyway, that's where I would begin. But it's a big question. So Anna, Paula.
Thank you, Marta. Thank you a lot for your inspiration. And I would point out a bit of my experience as a professor here in São Paulo in 2003. We had two public policies, important public policies. There is one called ProUni, which allows the students from the peripheral areas to achieve undergraduate scholarships. And it changed a lot the profile, the elitist profile of graduate schools in colleges in Brazil. And the second is the creation of Ministry of the Cities. These two things happened together. And I think it was very, how can I say, this provincialized us a lot when those students come from us. And then it was because of that I started this experiment of Lab Itaim Paulista, in which I engaged students from peripheral areas to become introduced in their own problems and how to improve these their capacities of change. It was and because of that, I think for us in Brazil and in all Latin America, the Marshall thought was very inspiring, since it was translated and it was studied and it was read a lot. Right. And it is what I think make a lot of sense for us. Thank you.
Thank you. I think those are great comments. And I would say the school I teach in at the City College of New York, or CUNY, is a public university. And it is a public university that's dedicated to teaching the children of the city of New York. And so it is and as I like to say, we're the future of the profession, right? The people who are in our school are what the profession will needs to become. We don't need to. So we do offer access to excellence for sure, as is our motto. But what we need to do is to not only offer access to excellence in terms of education, but also in terms of getting people into the professions, which are notoriously difficult for people of color to enter in the United States, notoriously segregated. So that is, at least with regard to Latinx and African American people from the who come out of the African diaspora in one way or another. For people from other ethnicities and backgrounds, there's more openness, but this prejudice is enduring, and it is structural. It is a perfect example of structural racism, in my view. So, but in our school, we show the professions what can happen, right? They need to come to us, and see our students. I wish we had a ministry for cities in the United States, but we don't. No. Renato.
Hi, Marta. I'm speaking to you. Is so inspiring your talk.
Thank you.
Again. Either in Brazil is the same, but we disguise our structural racism. So it's very hard to people, Black, African, Indian, to come to the work, to have good jobs, and also to understand their possibility of roles in our society. And we don't have anymore the Minister of Cities, so we are in an extreme right-wing government. So it's another moment of our life. But I was here remembering I was in Campinas doing my Master of Science in History, Social History, at the University of Campinas when Marshall Berman came to a talk with Marilena Chauí, who is moderating the debate, who is a great philosopher and professor. And I was remembering that something with the translation was very tricky, because at one point, people who are listening in English directly start to have tears in the face because the emotion of the talk. And people who are listening to the translation, not. So because that emotion came from the words, how it was, they were spoken. So this was my first contact, and my only contact with Marshall Berman personally. But the book was very important for us here, not only in Brazil, but in Latin America, to organize better the understanding of this triad, the modernization, modernity, and modernism. So the Argentinian start to do that as Adrian Gorelick start one of his most important tests on Latin American architecture, just retaking these concepts here. So One thing that I think that is some days ago, one art historian, was writing about his in an interview, writing about this difficulty for the new art, in this moment of our society, to find a way of art expression that corresponds to this situation, in the same sense that the modernism of the 9th century express the modernity, the process of modernity that started with the Enlightenment. So I don't know if you agree with that, but I think that this is the new challenge that we are facing, and the concepts of Marshall Berman is still valid more than ever. Do you agree with me, or?
I agree with you that the concepts of Berman are more valuable than ever, and I hope that was clear. And I also agree that we need to keep making new forms. I think Marshall was inspiring to me in the way that he kept looking to the streets, right, to find where the new forms were being made, particularly in music and art in New York. I don't know what Marshall thought about the contemporary architecture, and I think in his meaning the architecture of the 2010s or the 2000s or even the 1990s, I think his interest turned more to popular culture, and I really regret that he didn't get to write the last book, the last book in which was so much the top, in which youth culture and art and music, graffiti, street art were such a focus of his attention. And I mean, it was really so but knowing him in the way that I did, and knowing his work in the way that I do a bit, I would say that his focus has always been on, is that although he insists that we read history, right, and understand that he was never really much interested in revivals or historicism. He was much more concerned with work that addressed the problems of the moment, and so I hope that answers your question. I know in one of the editions of All That Is Solid, there's a preface about his experience of Brasilia, which is fantastic, right? Because he speaks about alienation and the sort of coupling of alienation and the sublime together, right? That it isn't an either or. It's not like, here's this amazing city built in the middle of nowhere. Like, why did this happen, right? We know why it happened, but that and that although there are all the problems that have been outlined over and over again by James Halston and so forth and so on, it's still an amazing place, right? And that we need to take them together, right? We can't ever. That's the dialectical piece of it. You can't say it's one or the other. It's both, right? And it's out of that tension that something new comes, right? Did I answer your question?
Of course. The most important takeaway that we have here is we think both. This is the dialectic way of thinking.
Yeah. And Naida, am I saying your name correctly? I apologize.
Eneida.
Oh, okay.
Obrigada. Eu vou transmitir a você, Marta, uma questão que foi formulada por alguém que nos escuta e acompanha pelo YouTube. A pergunta é de Laura Zancas Iris. E agora eu passo a ler. Muito obrigada, Marta. Você mencionou a importância de criar o acesso à profissão. Devemos também reformular e abrir a profissão? Essa é a pergunta da Laura.
Of course, yes, absolutely. The question is how. But I believe that if if we give access to the profession, we will change the profession, right? That's what will happen, right? And this is, I think, Anna's comment of earlier makes that clear, that when people from disadvantaged backgrounds or people who have been traditionally excluded are welcomed, things change, right? I mean, that's the history of our countries, both of them, and it's also, I think, a very real reason for the current repression, because the ways in which the democratizing impulses of the past 50 years, in which gender, race, all kinds of class, all kinds of presumed structures have been challenged, those who are calling the shots are pushing back, and they're pushing back because they're scared, and they should be. Yes, definitely, we should do so. But the moment is a sobering one, very, very sobering politically, as we watch, and certainly in the United States, as we watch what we assume to be bedrock principles of access, of equality being eroded. And I'm speaking here now just of the attacks on women's rights to control their own reproductive future, right? Which I certainly thought was won, that right, that it had been secured, but it looks like it's going to be erased. So. We should think of something positive to end on.
Yes.
Yeah.
Laura is here with us. Hi, Laura. Thank you for your question. Laura is from Mexico, and she was graduated in Harvard, and she's
So Laura, do you have suggestions?
I have the same questions.
Yeah, the same questions, right?
How, but I agree with, with you. It makes me think, by creating access is just a start. Perhaps the house will come once you open up to different frameworks of work or of thinking, and to create access to different voices. Right. The moment that the current space of action, whatever that means, now it could be academic, but it could be also within the government, or from the private sector or NGOs or whatever. The moment you diversify and open up the access of different voices, and perhaps change the format, same as Anna was saying, this lab is unique in the moment that it is in the city. It's there, it kind of in the real world, touching it, so it certainly informs the practice, because we've been taught many times to think, okay, what is the practice? So how do we get there, to that practice that solves in this way this type of problems? So what tools do we need? We were framed that way,
Yeah, it's tough.
It's tough. And in a more both, it's a moment that is tough because it's also very complex, and it's very complex, very politicized. It's complex. So how to deal as well with this complexity, with the tension, with the conflict as part of it,
Yeah.
And to be optimistic as Berman.
But I think they are our future. I'm very proud to have these students with us, and it is a great thing. So thank you a lot.
You're welcome. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to meet you all and to see you all again.
Yeah, it was an exciting debate, and I should bring it with us in the future, and the challenge of the future. Thank you.
Okay. Take care, everybody. Have a great conference. Ciao. Bye-bye.
Bye, Marta.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Welcome.